Right now, somewhere on Instagram, a travel influencer is posting a sunset photo from Cartagena de Indias. Golden light, pink walls, a cocktail, hashtag paradise. They are standing, without knowing it, on the largest slave port in the history of the Western Hemisphere. Cartagena today receives over 3 million tourists a year. Its colonial walled city, the Ciudad Amurallada, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Boutique hotels charge $600 a night inside walls that took 200 years and uncountable human lives to build. The tourism board calls it the jewel of the Caribbean. It is not wrong, but a jewel, by definition, is something extracted from the earth by force. This is the story of Cartagena de Indias. Not the postcard, the real one. The year is 1533. The Spanish conquistador Pedro de Heredia rides into a bay on the northern coast of South America and sees something that makes his breath stop. A natural harbor, deep, protected, almost perfectly circular, surrounded by mangroves and flat land. He has been looking for a place to anchor Spain's empire in the New World. He just found it. Within a decade, Cartagena will become the most important port in the Americas. Every ounce of gold and silver looted from the Inca and Aztec empires passes through this harbor on its way to Seville. The city grows fast. Churches, mansions, plazas, markets. Spain pours wealth into it. But wealth, in the 16th century, runs on a fuel that no one in Madrid wants to name out loud. It is 1580, and you are standing on a dock in Cartagena that smells like death. You smell it before you see it. A Portuguese slave ship rounding the headland, its hull riding low in the water. There are 350 people inside that hull. They have been there for 8 weeks. They crossed the Atlantic in a space smaller than a modern parking spot, chained together at the wrists and ankles. Somewhere between 60 and 90 of them did not survive the crossing. Their bodies were thrown into the Atlantic without ceremony, without names, without record. The 350 who survived, barely, are about to become property. Cartagena was officially designated the primary slave port of the Spanish Americas in 1595. This was not an accident. It was a bureaucratic decision made in an office in Seville by men who never saw a single ship. The asiento, the legal license to import enslaved Africans, was a contract traded between nations worth fortunes. Portugal held it first, then the Dutch, then the British, who would eventually use it as a pretext for war. Between 1533 and 1810, historians estimate that over 1 million enslaved Africans passed through Cartagena de Indias. 1 million. They came from Senegal, from Angola, from the Congo Basin, from the Gold Coast. They came speaking Wolof, Mandinka, Kikongo, Chui. They came with religions, philosophies, medical knowledge, musical traditions, entire civilizations compressed into human bodies that Spanish law classified as países de India, pieces of the Indies. A unit of cargo. The processing was clinical. Enslaved people who survived the crossing were held in barracones, holding pins near the dock, where they were inspected, branded with hot iron, baptized with a Christian name they had not chosen, and sold. The whole process took, on average, 3 days. 3 days to erase a life. Here is the fact that textbooks skip. The slave trade through Cartagena was not a dark footnote to the city's prosperity. It was the city's prosperity. The taxes on each enslaved person sold funded the construction of the city's churches. The labor of enslaved people built the harbor walls. Enslaved cooks, enslaved carpenters, enslaved masons, enslaved wet nurses. Every layer of Cartagena's colonial society rested on a foundation of forced African labor. When you look at a colonial mansion in the Ciudad Amurallada today and admire the woodwork on the balcony, you are admiring the work of someone who was not paid, not free, and not remembered. In 1610, a young Spanish Jesuit priest named Pedro Claver arrives in Cartagena. He is 30 years old, idealistic, and almost immediately horrified. Claver does something that no one in power, not the church, not the crown, not the merchant class, has thought necessary. He goes to the barracones. He walks into the holding pens where newly arrived enslaved Africans are kept before sale, and he stays there. He brings food, medicine, clean water. He learns enough Wolof and Kikongo to speak directly to people rather than through interpreters. He documents, obsessively, the conditions he witnesses. Over 44 years in Cartagena, Pedro Claver personally ministered to an estimated 300,000 enslaved people. He baptized them, which in the context of the era was the only legal mechanism for asserting that they had souls, and he advocated for their basic human treatment with a ferocity that made the city's elite despise him. He called himself Esclavo de los Esclavos, slave of the slaves. He was declared a saint in 1888. His body is still in Cartagena, in the church that bears his name, a few hundred meters from where the slave ships used to dock. Here is the part that makes you stop. Pedro Claver never once publicly called for the abolition of slavery. He ministered within the system. He made it more bearable. He documented its horrors. But he never said this must end. That question, whether compassion without abolition is enough, has no comfortable answer. It didn't then. It doesn't now. By 1650, Cartagena is the most valuable city in the Americas and therefore the most attacked. English pirates, Dutch warships, French buccaneers. The city is raided so many times that Spain makes a decision. They will build walls that cannot be broken. They commissioned the greatest military engineering project in the history of the New World. The Murallas de Cartagena, the city walls, took nearly 2 centuries to complete. They stretch for 11 kilometers around the old city. In some places, the walls are 17 meters high and 20 meters thick. They contain towers, bastions, moats, hidden passageways. When they were finally finished in the mid-1700s, military engineers declared them the most sophisticated fortification system in the Americas. The Spanish crown spent 68 million pesos on their construction. They did not spend a single peso on the people who built them. The labor force that constructed the murallas was almost entirely enslaved. Enslaved men mixed the mortar, cut the coral stone blocks, carried materials under the Caribbean sun in temperatures that regularly exceeded 35 degrees Celsius. The death toll from construction, from heat, from accidents, from disease, from sheer physical destruction, was never recorded. There are no monuments to these builders. There is no museum dedicated to their labor. There is a UNESCO plaque on the wall. Here is what the wall actually is. It is 11 kilometers of proof that human beings can be worked to death for the benefit of people who will later be photographed in front of their work and call it beautiful. Not everyone submitted. In 1599, before the walls were built, before Pedro Claver arrived, an enslaved man named Bencos Bioho did something that no one in the Spanish Americas had yet managed. He escaped, and he did not escape alone. Bencos Bioho, originally a king from the region of present-day Guinea-Bissau, led a mass escape from Cartagena and founded a free settlement in the jungle south of the city. He called it San Basilio de Palenque. For 20 years, Bencos Bioho led guerrilla raids against Spanish forces from Palenque. He was so militarily effective and so psychologically devastating to the colonial order that in 1612 the Spanish signed a peace treaty with him. They recognized Palenque's freedom. A colonial empire negotiating a treaty with escaped slaves. It had never happened before. The Spanish then invited Bencos Bioho to Cartagena for negotiations and arrested him. In 1621, they executed him publicly. They were terrified that his survival meant others would follow. But here is what they did not understand. Palenque did not need him to survive. The community survived. San Basilio de Palenque is still there today. It is the oldest free African town in the Americas. Its people still speak Palenquero, a Creole language that blends Spanish with Kikongo and other Bantu languages, a linguistic fossil of resistance, still alive, spoken by around 3,000 people in 2024. Bencos Bioho's face is on a monument in Cartagena now. The city that executed him put his face on a monument. History has a brutal sense of irony. Colombia abolished slavery in 1851. By that point, Cartagena's Afro-Colombian population, the descendants of the million people who had passed through this port in chains, were concentrated in the poorest neighborhoods of the city. Getsamani, La Baquilla, Tierrabamba. They were free, legally. They owned nothing. They had no land, no capital, no political representation, and no access to the education system that might have changed any of that. Freedom without reparation is a different kind of trap. In 2024, Cartagena's Afro-Colombian population, estimated at 35 to 40% of the city, remains disproportionately concentrated in those same neighborhoods. The Ciudad Amurallada, where boutique hotels charge $600 a night, is predominantly white and tourist-facing. The neighborhoods where the descendants of enslaved people live have average incomes a fraction of those inside the walls. The walls are still a boundary. They just no longer need guards. You can walk the walls of Cartagena at sunset. Most tourists do. The light is genuinely extraordinary. That specific Caribbean gold that turns everything cinematic. You can buy a cocktail from a vendor on the battlements and watch the container ships move through the harbor below. The harbor where the slave ships came in. The stones under your feet are 400 years old. They were cut by hands that are now nameless. They were laid by people who did not choose to be there, in a city they did not choose, building fortifications to protect the wealth of an empire that classified them as cargo. Cartagena de Indias is magnificent. That is not a lie. But magnificence built on erasure is a debt, and debts have a way of compounding. San Basilio de Palenque is 70 kilometers from Cartagena. If you leave the tourist zone, take a bus south, and walk into that village, you will hear Palenquero spoken in the street. You will see the direct descendants of people who refused, who ran, who built something of their own in the jungle when everything else was taken. That is also Cartagena's story, the part that didn't make the UNESCO plaque. The next time you see a photo of Cartagena, the pink walls, the golden light, the bougainvillea, ask yourself whose hands built those walls. History doesn't always answer, but it always remembers. If this story moved you, leave a comment below. And if you want more history that the textbooks buried, you know where to find us.